I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Lani Kass, Senior Advisor at the Center for American Defense Studies and a Senior Fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Dr. Kass' experience includes past roles as Senior Policy Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, Senior Mentor to the USAF Project CHECKMATE, Director of the Cyber Task Force, Professor of Military Strategy and Operations at the National War College, and more recently as Senior Vice President at CACI International and a member of the Board of Visitors at the USAF Institute of Technology. Dr. Kass is a graduate at the National War College, National Defense University, holds a PhD from the Kaplan School of Economics and Political Science, and a joint PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this interview are the opinions of Dr. Kass alone and do not represent the views or opinions of her employer or the United States government. So, Lani, welcome. Thank you for joining me, and thank you as well for your career of service. Today, we're focused on allegations of war crimes in Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to put the disclaimer in there, right? Just to highlight that these are your opinions alone. But I'd like to start out with a little backstory to help everyone understand this situation. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a surprise to many, but should we have seen this coming?
Yeah. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Tim. And let me add to the disclaimer, the views are mine and mine alone. I'm free since I retired to say just about anything I want to do. And I'm no longer associated with the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Studies. 2 years I retired from them as well. So the views are completely mine based on pretty extensive experience, as you mentioned. My PhD is in international relations. I am fluent in Russian and every East European language, as well as French and several others. So I kind of am not a consumer of propaganda, which unfortunately has shaped a lot of the ongoing discussion. I personally was not surprised at the Russian invasion on February 24, 2022. Putin warned that it's going to happen on numerous occasions. And of course, we had the invasion of Crimea in 2014, as well as the invasion of Jordan in Georgia in 2008. So it shouldn't have been a surprise. Russia perceives NATO expansion as an existential threat to itself. Whether you agree with this perception or not, it is one of those things that just is. You know, and 5 millennia ago, a Chinese philosopher said, know the enemy and know yourself. And in 1,000 battles, you will be victorious, which means you have to understand the perspective of the adversary as well as the friends, even if you don't agree with it. So nothing that I am saying is designed in any way to justify anything. What Russia has done, is doing, is unjustifiable by any international humanitarian norm. But to truly understand the causes for the war, how it is conducted, and to try to end that war. And I'll come to the war termination with your help, hopefully, toward the end of our discussion. We need to look at matters from Russia's perspective. And the way it looks from Moscow is that despite promises to the contrary, NATO has continuously, since 1991, expanded to Russia's borders, ever closer to Russia's borders. And again, it doesn't look terrible when you look at it from Washington, D.C. But if you look from Moscow out, the encirclement is unmistakable. Now, we perceive NATO as an inherently defensive alliance, and it is. It has been created as a defensive alliance. The Russians don't see it as such. And I'll tell an anecdote that I don't often share because, I've been in a lot of international meetings, and most of what transpires at those remains very highly classified and closely held. But this is one that kind of illustrates this point. So this is back in 2011, and the US-Russia military-to-military relationships at the time were excellent, very, very close. We had open lines of communications, 3, 4, 5 times a year visits, observers at each other's exercises, etc., etc. And I am a witness to a conversation between my boss, the senior most officer in the United States military, and the key advisor to the President of the United States, and his Russian counterpart. And Admiral Mullen says, "Trust me, please, NATO is not aimed against you." And he meant it from the bottom of his heart. He was totally sincere. And General Makarov, his Russian counterpart, looks him straight in the eye and says, "Mike, I completely believe you. Who is NATO against?" Dead silence. Because right there in that very simple question, you had the essence of the different perception.
Yeah.
Our alliances are for something. Russia perceives alliances as against something or somebody. So his question was, from his perspective, truly articulating their point of view. NATO has to be against someone, otherwise it has no reason for being. And the only country that it is against is Russia.
Well, and so Lani, if I could, just for the audience
Sure.
information, Ukraine first mentioned wanting to join NATO in 2002. And in 2017, the Ukrainian parliament adopted legislation reinstating membership in NATO as a strategic foreign and security policy objective.
Right.
So, yeah, they were openly interested in joining NATO. I'd heard talk of that. Actually, I'd read articles talking about Ukraine wanting to join NATO last year, I believe.
Right.
So what you're saying is, in terms of objectives, the primary objective is Putin wanting to prevent a democratic encirclement of Russia, And then I have also read that they had strategic goals of wanting the port city of Odessa, possibly. And I've read speculation as well about territorial expansionism. And again, that's just speculation, but it goes to Crimea in 2014, and Ukraine was presumably next on that list, I guess.
So let me try to set a little bit more nuanced context,
Thank you.
if I might.
Oh, absolutely.
Because unfortunately, and I'm very grateful to you that you want to explain and understand the context, because context matters. We have reduced the discussion to, me, thousand, you, Jane. Russia bad, Ukraine good, end of discussion. It is actually much, much more layered and nuanced. So NATO is established in 1949 after the end of World War II, with the funny but true objectives to keep the United States in, meaning in Europe, to keep the Soviet Union out, and to keep Germany down.
Yeah.
It was never said in those words, but surely that was the objective. Initially, NATO has only 12 members. We are now up to 30 in an alliance that operates by complete consensus of all its members, meaning the United States or Canada's vote, or France's or Germany's, counts as much as Montenegro. Few people know Montenegro is a NATO member, or Slovenia, or name the teeny tiny country of your choice. NATO expansion accelerated, obviously, in 91 with the first tranche of admission, which, in my humble view, should have been the end. And that was Poland, Hungary, and at that time, Czechoslovakia, which later split. Interestingly, at the time, Czechoslovakia didn't even want to join NATO, because NATO is a military alliance. Czechoslovakia was interested in the EU, but it got a package deal, so it joined NATO. The subsequent expansion, and again, probably the most painful to Russia, was 1990 when the wall fell. Germany is united, and united Germany now joins NATO, sort of bringing NATO military to Russia's border. This is the time that promises were made. NATO is not going to expand any further east. Those promises were violated. And the second most neuralgic, I would say, pinpoint for Russia was the admission of former Soviet republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, into NATO. Not that militarily they matter any. I mean, neither even has an air force, and NATO has to do air policing for them.
Ah, okay.
But because they were former Soviet socialist republics, that was perceived as a very proximate threat to Russia. I would say Russia cared much less about Croatia, for example, joining NATO later, or Montenegro or Macedonia, which joined in 2020, with the most recent candidates, Finland and Sweden, who were invited this summer, specifically in July. Ukraine formally applied, you're correct in what you said, but Ukraine formally applied for membership in the middle of the war, specifically in September this year, violating the cardinal role of NATO's membership application program, which basically has three components. The country has to be a democracy. It cannot have active territorial disputes with any of its neighbors. And it has to be a contributor to NATO's security. So it was kind of poking a sharp stick in Russia's eye. But NATO expansion, I would say, is the proximate cause of the war. Not a justification by any stretch, but every war has a casus belli, the proximate cause of the war. And NATO expansion over the years is what led to this war. Putin has been warning against it repeatedly. Georgia applied for membership, Ukraine applied for membership. Both from Russia's perspective, especially Ukraine. That's a major red line that was crossed.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Now, and you mentioned part of that membership plot process is not having territorial disputes. As I understand things, I want to touch on Ukraine's two easternmost regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, which are commonly known as the Donbass. The Russian military announced a goal back in March of what they called the liberation of the Donbass. And some polls have found support by citizens in these regions wanting to join Russia. Although I should mention that the polls vary wildly from source to source. And so, yeah, I would be remiss to quote any kind of poll numbers. I didn't even put numbers in this. But
and I wouldn't put much credence to public opinion polls conducted, at gunpoint by either side. And again, it's very important to emphasize by either side, because in this polarization of Ukraine all good, Russia all bad, during the last, I would say, at least a decade, the Ukrainians, the government in Kiev, has been conducting a pretty vicious campaign against Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine. Now, there is an interesting distinction here that most people don't understand. Ukraine conducted the census in 2001, wherein less than 30% of the population identified as ethnic Russians. It wasn't convenient to do so. A lot of Jews don't self-identify as Jews. I think the better distinction is Russian-speaking and non-Russian-speaking. But Ukraine has been conducting a really vicious policy. One could call it ethnic cleansing in the Donbass. And again, I'm not restating Russian propaganda. It's reality documented by various international organizations. So Luhansk or Lugansk, depending whether you're a Russian speaker or Ukrainian speaker, and Donetsk declared their independence based on the referendum that you mentioned. Interestingly, Putin withheld recognition for quite some time. He didn't recognize them until quite recently after the war. So, I know I'll get crucified for saying Russia has been exercising restraint, but in truth, it has. And it has been warning Ukraine against those policies against Russian-speaking population, most of whom are also Greek Orthodox rather than Christian. So the main division here to look at is not the Donbass and Crimea, which is a story in and of itself, but rather East and West Ukraine, with the East having traditionally, historically, been a part of the Romanov Tsarist Empire and later the Soviet Union, and Western Ukraine, which traditionally, historically, has been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then a really terrible period between the two, World War I and World War II, where Ukraine was essentially a fascist Nazi state. Few people want to admit it, again, extremely well documented. And then, of course, becomes part of the Soviet Union. So that is the national division. The natural boundary between the East and the West is at the Dnieper or Dniepro, if you want to use Ukrainian river. Kiev is bisected by that river.
Okay.
So when the Russians invaded, my prediction, and I was wrong, was a lightning Russian strike to the Dnieper river and halt at the river. There was nothing lightning about it.
Yeah.
So that was a surprise to most experts. The Russian commitment of forces was very limited. Their pace of advance was slow. If you recall the first days of any war that the United States has recently conducted, so-called shock and awe. Remember Desert Storm. How do we know it starts? CNN goes off the air. Total darkness in Baghdad. That never happened in Ukraine. And it never happened not because the Russians couldn't do it. They chose not to do it. Now, we can speculate at great length why, but they didn't. And not having achieved their objectives quickly, they got into a war from which it is exceedingly difficult to withdraw. I would say the analogy of World War I very much applies here. Remember, the boys will be home by Christmas. Well, it wasn't until 4 years later in senseless slaughter and trench warfare and millions of military and civilian casualties that finally the peace accord in Versailles was signed.
Yeah. Well, Lani, on that note, let me get into some of the allegations of war crimes in Ukraine.
Sure.
And it's because I think that this is a topic of very clear humanitarian concern. It's also something with very long-term geopolitical ramifications.
Sure.
Both sides in this conflict have been accused of committing war crimes. It seems as though the accusations are predominantly against Russian forces. So I should start by asking, Is Russia more likely to be accused simply because they're the invader, they're in
Yes.
close proximity to civilians, and they're more vulnerable to these types of accusations?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, since you are so great, I've done numerous interviews and nobody ever lets you finish a sentence and lay out a context. So, I'm glad not to have to speak in sound bites and actually try to advance a logical discussion rather than, just make a word salad. So let me explain what is a war crime, because most people don't even understand
Oh,
that.
yes, please.
So there is what is called a just war tradition, deeply rooted in the Judeo-Christian religion and moral and ethical system, going back to the Bible and to Saint Augustine. So you're talking, at least 2 millennia ago. It has been codified in a series of international conventions, predominantly what we know as the Hague and the Geneva Conventions. And they have actually very clear and strict definitions of war crimes. To kind of set a frame around it, ethical, legal behavior in war usually has 3 elements. The first one is called proportionality, meaning the amount of force you use does not exceed a military justification. Start with, this is very difficult to judge objectively.
Yes.
The second one is clear. It is non-combatant immunity, meaning you will not deliberately target civilians. It allows, understands the inevitable collateral damage in war, where civilian and military targets are in close proximity, but the deliberate targeting of civilians as people and civilian targets as infrastructure is considered a war crime. Now, by that measure, the bombing of Dresden, of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki are all war crimes.
Okay.
So we have non-combatant immunity, we have proportionality, and the last and probably the most important but difficult to measure is intent, meaning did you aim at a military target but hit a hospital by mistake? And that is why war crimes are investigated, and there is an international mechanism for investigating, bringing to trial, and prosecuting and putting people, the responsible, in jail. Exceedingly complex and lengthy process. So knowing I am going to be talking to you, I actually looked up how many cases are pending in front of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, By the way, the United States does not recognize the jurisdiction of that court as it applies to U.S. servicemen, which should be an interesting point to consider. In other words, we want to bring others to justice, but we are, by our own, because we said so, we are immune from persecution. So let me just look at the cases. I actually wrote them down, and it will amaze you. The process, as I said, is very lengthy. Pending right now, as of this morning, in front of the court are war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Congo, which was first brought in front of the court in 2004, Uganda the same year, Sudan 2005, Kenya 2010, Libya 2011, Georgia, not Russia, but Georgia, concerning the 2008 conflict. The case was opened in 2016. The court calls the state of Palestine concerning atrocities in Gaza in 2014, Bangladesh and Myanmar 2016, US in Afghanistan, and the accusation there is not just war crimes, but crimes against humanity and war crimes pending since 2003, Philippines and Venezuela. So,
yeah, it takes decades.
Moves slowly.
Decades.
Decades. So bring them to justice is a great sentiment, and I am all for it. As long as we all understand it is a very deliberative process, which, like in any court of law, involves collecting evidence. It includes the presumption of innocence. It requires presentation of both incriminating and exculpatory evidence and giving each equal weight. I actually looked up that since its establishment, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, looked at 31 cases, issued 38 arrest warrants, had 10 convictions, 4 acquittals, and all that since 1988, when it was established. So it's not something that existed forever, contrary to what most people think. It was established by international agreement called the Rome Statute in Rome, Italy, in 1988.
Okay.
So it's a fairly small staff. It's 900 people, not a huge budget. And again, the credibility of the court is undermined by the fact that the United States does not recognize its jurisdiction over its service members. It recognizes the jurisdiction over others. Kind of an interesting position.
Well, it does help. It does help. And thank you so much for sharing that. So some of the allegations, and let me phrase them as allegations, right?
Sure.
Because as you mentioned, it is a court of
'Cause they
law
are.
and they haven't been proven yet. But in terms of allegations, those include indiscriminate attacks, attacks against civilian targets, the use of cluster munitions, ill treatment, torture, and willful killing of civilians, use of human shields, placement of military objectives near civilian objectives. Some of the things that I think bother people, definitely myself the most, mass killings have been
Yeah.
reported. There have been allegations of that. There have been allegations of sexual violence. I will
Yes.
just leave it there. In addition to deportations, poor treatment of prisoners of war, and looting. And again, both Ukrainian and Russian forces have been accused of these, although
Right.
the media reports indicate that Russia is allegedly more engaged in them.
Well, by definition, the country or side, if you're dealing like in Gaza, it's not a country, it's a terrorist organization fighting against a nation state, or a nation state fighting against a terrorist organization. The side that is on the offensive is bound to be accused of more violence and more war crimes. It's just the nature of military operations. All of the things that you mentioned are by international law, by the Geneva and Hague Conventions and the UN Charter and the Rome Statute, all constitute war crimes. You cannot deliberately target civilians. Again, that goes back to the principles of proportionality, intent, non-combatant immunity. The Russians have argued that the Ukrainians are using people as human shields. I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows. Possible in urban combat, targets are intermingled. Russia does not use as many precision munitions as the United States does. Now, precision munitions do not avoid civilian casualties, as we know. And the United States has been referred to the court in 2003 for crimes against humanity and war crimes in Afghanistan. So that all would go to intent. If you use a precision munition or an armed drone to kill a bad guy, and by mistake you had a wedding, you could argue, I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah.
Right? That's the issue of intent. So we all know that even precision munitions aren't. Israel is known to go out of its way to try to avoid civilian casualties. It can't, nobody can. Unfortunately, since time immemorial, civilians have been a casualty of war. They're not combatants. They are technically, theoretically protected, but in wartime, they are inevitable victims. Sexual crimes, sexual violence are particularly heinous. They have been, unfortunately, part of human history since time immemorial. Completely off topic, but I'll mention it. It's worth directing your readers to, and maybe you should actually do a separate interview on the topic. In Kenya, Reuters just concluded a 10-year investigation into rape by Boko Haram, which is the Islamic terrorist organization that dominates half of Kenya. Remember the kidnapping of the girls from the Christian school?
Yes.
And Michelle Obama free our girls. Well, those girls are women now. Some of them were impregnated by Boko Haram terrorists. And the Kenyan government is conducting a campaign of forced abortions because they believe that those children or fetuses, however you want to define it, have in their blood, to be against the secular Christian government of Kenya. A horrifying report. It's like 90 pages. It's journalism at its finest. The reason I'm mentioning it, we all recoil from crimes like that.
Yes.
But they have been around since time immemorial. Rape has been an instrument of war. It's mentioned in the Bible. And the Bible says, don't do that. Well, people have been doing it. Unfortunately, it happened in the former Yugoslavia. It happened on a massive scale during World War II. As horrific as it is not new.
Yes.
The one aspect of war crimes that you did not mention, and it's very explicitly stipulated in the Geneva Conventions, is the treatment of prisoners of war.
Okay.
And both sides have been accused of atrocities. And I firmly believe both sides have committed atrocities. At the very beginning of the war, I want to say it was in April, the Ukrainian Surgeon General tweeted that every Russian POW should be castrated. It was on a tweet. He was very gently admonished that that's not the kind of image Ukraine wants to project. So he scaled it down to let's just shoot them in both knees. Well, neither is okay under the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah.
The Geneva Conventions are actually, especially the Third Geneva Convention, are so explicit as to the treatment of POWs that public humiliation of POWs is considered a war crime. A couple of days ago, I was very casually watching CNN, and they accompany a Ukrainian unit, unclear where, and they conduct a raid into a Russian unit. So it's somewhere in Ukraine, presumably somewhere in Donetsk. And they grab a few Russian prisoners, and they proceed to abuse them in front of the CNN cameras. And the CNN reporter, is interviewing this Russian sergeant, not a young man, who has his trousers and underpants pulled down, and they blur the image, but they are interviewing him, completely oblivious that they have now participated in a war crime, because exposing a prisoner of war in any way, shape, or form is banned by international conventions. Now, is anybody going to bring CNN to the ICC in The Hague? No, unlikely. Yeah. But the reason I'm even mentioning it, people have very limited understanding of what's permissible and what is not. And parading POWs like the Vietnamese have done, making them make propaganda statements, remember during the Vietnam War?
Yes.
Is a war crime. By definition, that is a war crime. The Iraqis did the same thing during Desert Storm, when they shut down American and British and French pilots, paraded them on television. That, even if they did not abuse them, which they did, and we have kind of kept quiet about it. I have very close friends who have been POWs in Iraq. We have not talked much about it for a variety of reasons. But the mere fact of having them on television is a war crime. So the definition of what constitutes a war crime is much more elaborate when it comes to treatment of prisoners of war, who arguably are the most vulnerable in any war. Because, when you finish a battle and you have people killed your comrades, they alive and they in your hands and they helpless, it is human instinct to want to extract revenge.
Yes.
I mean, it's instinct. There is, no two ways about it. And there were cases in the United States that we all know about. And people were brought to a court martial and actually convicted. That is why the international conventions spend so much time explaining treatment of prisoners of war. This is a little bit of a different war in the sense that you don't have clear front lines. You do not have very clear combatants. I mean, you do, the ones that wear uniforms, but, Ukraine fields, guard battalions. It fields the International Legion, which is basically mercenaries. Are they legal combatants? Well, actually, per the Geneva Conventions, they're not. Do they deserve humane treatment? Absolutely. But are they protected by the conventions? They are not. That is why the United States could treat the Guantanamo prisoners very differently than it treated uniformed prisoners of war. Okay. So there is a legal distinction. Doesn't make it right. I'm not justifying anything. I'm just explaining, the legal parameters.
No, that does make sense.
So, undoubtedly, Russia is guilty of war crimes. taking it to a level of genocide, which is a deliberate extermination of civilians, that to me is a step too far. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, so I do not use the term genocide loosely. There is no attempt to exterminate the Ukrainian people. I mean, it's absurd in the extreme. And from the military perspective, as horrific as the Russian strikes appear on television, they are actually quite restrained. And what I mean by that, you have not seen carpet bombing. You have not seen the shock and awe that the United States inflicted. Now, arguably, here is the principle of proportionality. If you do it hard and fast, you could argue you minimize civilian suffering. That's why there is a court that would deliberate it. If you've been to Dresden, bombed out quarter that still stands, if you've been to Hiroshima or Nagasaki, if you've been to Baghdad, civilian infrastructure has been leveled. So is the case in Syria, so is the case in Libya, so is the case in a whole bunch of other places. Modern warfare is exceedingly lethal. And I think most people have a hard time coming to terms with it. Could we go for just a second to your definition of war crimes? I want to give you the official definition, the official listing.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's really interesting. There is no single internationally accepted document that defines what is and what isn't a war crime, which is why you have a court that determines was it or was it not. But the most authoritative document is the Rome Statute, which I mentioned before, which established the International Criminal Court. And here is the list: intentional attacks on civilians and on civilian installations, appropriation of territory. So, in other words, declaring a part of an occupied country, your territory is considered a war crime, especially if you expel the indigenous population.
Okay.
Not very often, immediately coming to people's mind when you talk about war crime. Forced deportation of civilians, pillaging, certain munitions, the use of certain munitions are considered war crimes. And this is an interesting point because you mentioned cluster munitions.
Yes.
So 100 countries prohibit, there is a separate agreement. 100 countries prohibit the use of cluster munitions. None of the major players is a signatory to that part.
Okay.
Not the United States, not Russia, not Israel, no NATO member. I think with the exception of Holland, there is also a separate convention on prohibition of mines. Remember, it was Princess Diana's kind of cause.
Yes.
Again, there is a separate convention to which the United States is not a part. Certain munitions are banned by other international conventions. So there is a convention prohibiting the use, but not the possession of chemical weapons. So you can have them, but you can't employ them. And there is another convention prohibiting both the possession and the use of biological weapons. Now, as we all know, chemical weapons have been used on the battlefield. The convention is a reaction to the horrific use of gas in World War I.
Yes.
But I believe Egypt, Italy and Libya before World War II, and then Egypt against Yemen in 1966 were the first major violations of that convention. It's part of the Geneva Conventions. It's a separate protocol. There is a huge debate whether Agent Orange, widely used in Vietnam, is or isn't to be considered chemical warfare. Again, it comes to intent. The intent was defoliation of the jungle, not killing people. Millions of Vietnamese, thousands of US veterans, including my husband, are sick from Agent Orange. But the intent was not to do that. So that's why definitions are so important, because they find the emotions.
Well, in terms, and again, going back to Ukraine for a moment, a UN-appointed independent international commission of inquiry recently published a report documenting what they described as unlawful killings, including summary executions of large numbers of civilians across 30 different settlements in Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. And then please let me apologize for not pronouncing this correctly.
Pronouncing it amazingly well.
And so they'd accused Russian armed forces of this while they controlled these areas in February and March. And so, it seems in that sense, it seems like that would be a clear definition of war crimes. And one of the things that I'd wondered about, I guess, without sounding like an apologist, but I do realize that Russian military leadership in the field has taken a lot of casualties.
Yes.
Their military, as I understand things, lacks experienced non-commissioned officers who would hopefully help restrain the less experienced people in their command. And they've recently implemented a draft, and the draft is since these were documented. But I'm wondering if these factors could contribute to some of these accusations of war crimes.
So let me give you a short answer and then a long answer. So the short answer is definitely yes. The long answer is much more complicated. Can I just finish the reading of the list of war crimes?
Because yes, absolutely.
Said that explicitly prohibited. So is the use of human shields, starvation, meaning you destroy food supplies, happening in Ethiopia as we speak, has happened several times, child soldiers, sexual violence, other grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. So it's kind of boldly concluded. Not a shadow of a doubt, that taking a bunch of civilians and executing them is a war crime. You don't need lawyers for that. But when an international court would investigate it, the first question would be, were those really civilians or were they unlawful combatants?
Okay.
So there is a whole category for armed people who are not in uniform, not subject to the military discipline and code and laws of armed combat, which is a whole different category. And both the Russians have them in the form of the Wagner Group, mercenaries, paid, we have them too, Blackwater. They weren't exactly Boy Scouts. The Ukrainians have them in the form of Nazi, and I mean really Nazi, not neo-Nazi, Azov battalions. So the first question would be, are those really non-combatants, meaning women, children, old people, or are those fighting age males that just happened not to wear a uniform?
Okay.
So there is a distinction, and the latter would be called unlawful combatants. So that's one. Second, on the Russian military, there is a lot of misperception that somehow, because Russian soldiers are drafted, they are inherently worse than volunteers. That's a fairy tale. The United States had a draft till 1975. World War I, World War II were won by draftees.
Yes.
Draftees fought in Korea and Vietnam. The Israeli Defense Force has a draft. Nobody would say it's a bad military. The Russians have a draft. Their military has always, going back centuries, has always been a draft military. So is, by the way, the Ukrainian military. It's draft-based. Both countries, as part of a military reform, created a category of professional, what's called contract soldiers. So those are conscripts who then choose, after finishing their obligatory service, to stay in the military, and they get paid not just a living stipend, but they actually get a salary. That is the professional core of the Russian military. It's not huge, but those are the professional non-commissioned officers. So while it is correct to say the Russian military lacks the professional non-commissioned officer corps similar to the United States, that would be correct. It doesn't equate to that Russia does not have non-commissioned officers.
Yes. From what I've read, their responsibilities are different. And that was what I was alluding to.
Their responsibility definitely are different. The Russian military also has many more officers than the United States has, which accounts for the number of Russian officers, who have been killed on the battlefield. They lead from the front. So if you compare the number of officers that the Russians lost, use US criteria, you would say the Russians lost a lot of officers, which is, on the face of it, true. But there is a reason for it. Their officers, especially junior officers, fulfill the roles of NCOs in the US military. So they are much closer to the front than our officers would be. By the way, the Russian structure is not fundamentally different from the IDF structure, where officers are on the front line and NCOs are predominantly in technical jobs.
Okay.
So the US model is unique. It's by no stretch of the imagination the international norm. So to say Putin started the draft is untrue, in the extreme. What he has done, there is a draft. There has always been a draft.
Okay.
What he has done is call up the reserve. Very limited call up. Again, not unique. The United States cannot go to war without mobilizing the Guard. In Russia, the reserve forces, those are trained troops, officers, and enlisted who have left, completed their duty, or officers who have retired. You can recall them back to active duty. Putin has done that on a fairly limited basis. Now that got, incredible coverage in the US media that he's drafting and throwing draftees into the front line. Again, that's untrue in the extreme. Those are people who have completed their military service, have been in the reserve, and you call them back to active duty. Now, they're not as well trained as active duty units. Same in the United States. If you put an active Army unit next to a National Guard unit, now all my National Guard friends are going to be very angry with this statement, but they're not at the same level. And it's natural. If you train every day, if you operate equipment every day, you are much more proficient than somebody who was in the military, say, 5 or 10 years ago, and is getting back reacquainted.
That makes sense.
Now, I would say that the reservists, by definition, would tend to be less disciplined than the regular active duty military. And that applies in any military I'm familiar with. And there are several reasons. One is they never wanted to be sent to the front lines. And I'm not saying that the active duty guys wanted to be sent to the front lines, but those guys, the reservists, were taken from whatever they were doing, policemen, firemen, school teachers, engineers, architects, medics, you name it, told to put a uniform and go fight. Okay, so they older, they married, they most likely have kids at home. They don't want to be there.
Yes,
So,
I think you're saying they're in a different place in life, and
yeah,
even though they realized it was a possibility, it's something they didn't anticipate, and they've had to put a full active adult life on
correct,
hold to go into a
correct,
conflict.
correct. So, and that's an excellent point you're raising, because for the last 20 years, the US National Guard has been employed and deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan
Yes,
in
yes,
a manner that a lot of people said, hey, I didn't sign up for that. And there were issues with our Guard in Reserve as well. In Russia, it is exceedingly rare to recall reservists. As a matter of fact, I cannot think of an example since World War II. So, as you said, those people truly never expected to have to do that again. And life for a soldier in the Russian military, and again, I'm not exonerating or justifying, I'm just saying, is not fun.
yes,
They subject to a lot of abuse. There is a lot of hazing. It's condoned. The hazing is condoned. That makes you a man. Remember, you a draftee, you're 18 years old. You might be 21 if you got a deferment to go to college first. But those are young kids from all over the country. So they are subject to hazing by kind of the upperclassmen. Think a college fraternity, that you have hazing and assaulted rituals. A lot of that has been moderated, but think the bad old days, when people actually were abused to the point of dying. So life as a Russian soldier is no fun. So now imagine that you are an established, or I take you're a journalist, and all of a sudden you get called up, put in your old uniform, which may or may not fit you, grab a rifle and go fight in Ukraine. Your entire emotional state is fundamentally different
yes.
than a soldier who, okay, that's my job for the next 2 years. So let me make the best of it, which was the case for American draftees, since time immemorial until we went to an alternative force in 1975. So after Vietnam. So, to say that draftees are by definition wolves, I think it's just incorrect. And again, the Ukrainian military, while trained by NATO and has been trained by NATO for a long time, the first action plan, membership action plan with Ukraine, which is kind of the first step for NATO membership, dates back to 2002.
Okay.
Little known factoid, both the Ukrainians and the Georgians deployed with the United States to Iraq and Afghanistan. Why? Because they wanted NATO military training. And NATO paid a lot of money that they could send home. So you had Ukrainian and Georgian units in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen them. I was not impressed by either. But they draftees as well. So even across Europe, Poland has a draft. It's a superb military. Israel hasn't dropped. It's a superb military. So that by itself doesn't.
That wouldn't be a factor.
Yeah. In my view, is not a factor. The behavior, I would tend to attribute more to people who truly do not want to be there. They want it over as soon as possible. They undisciplined because they've been civilians for a long time. Some use drugs, a lot of alcoholics, so the behavior is difficult to restrain. Waging war on people who speak a language that you understand, and Ukrainian and Russian are supremely similar. And against people who look just like you is exceedingly difficult, which is why civil wars tend to be the most vicious. I don't call this a civil war. It's not. It's an invasion by a sovereign state against another sovereign state. But in terms of the cruelty and the outrage and the war crimes, it has all the makings of a civil war.
Rape,
arson, shooting of civilians. Think about the American Civil War. Think about any civil war that is happening worldwide now. Those are exceptional in their cruelty, because in order to kill, you need to demonize the enemy. The taboo against taking life is ingrained in every human being.
Yes.
So crossing, unless you're a sociopath, crossing that threshold takes a significant mental effort. And it is easier to kill somebody that you present to the soldier as subhuman.
Yes, I was going to say, dehumanization of the enemy, and then demonization of the enemy as well.
It makes it easier to kill. When you take it to the extreme, like the Nazis did, it leads to a genocide. But this war is particularly cruel because it is between two countries that have been one and part of the same sphere for centuries. And the territory went back and forth. But the origin of today's Russia are in Kiev. I actually wrote down, and I'll look it up because even I don't remember when that was.
Well, Lani, as I understand things, also, and I'm really too young. I never understood the dynamics of the Cold War, right, when I was growing up. But as I understand things, Ukraine was not necessarily a willing participant in the Soviet Union, and there was a class system of sorts. And the only reason I mention that is it sounds like there may be some animosity and hostile feelings between these two cultures. And that's what you're alluding to, right? They're close enough to bring out exceptional cruelty in this war.
Yes, that's a really good encapsulation on your part. So the first unity treaty between Ukraine and Russia was signed in get this, 1654.
Okay.
Okay, unity. Interestingly enough, Soviet Prime Minister Khrushchev, who was an ethnic Ukrainian, gifted Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic on the 300th anniversary of that unity treaty.
Now, if I could interject, I had just, and that may have been something you had written online. Yeah. So Khrushchev, and I, as an aside, I did interview his son Sergei many years ago.
I know him.
Yeah, and so Prime Minister Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Russia, but if I understand correctly, to Ukraine, and if I understand correctly, that's now being contested, and part of the issue was that they were doing that to complete construction projects. If I remember correctly, there was actually there was a cost saving motive associated with that. I may be incorrect, but
no, there is a slew of reasons why Khrushchev gifted Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. He was in a power struggle. This is right after the death of Stalin. He needed to build support. He needed then the head of the Communist Party in Ukraine to support him. It was Kremlin palace intrigue. And understand, at the time of the Soviet Union, this was like, moving school district boundaries. I mean, it was irrelevant. It was a grand gesture, but it was pretty meaningless.
Because they were both part of the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. So,
yes.
And at the time, and you can see how integrated it was that an ethnic Ukrainian was the senior-most person in the Soviet Union at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Think about it. But at that time, you had ethnic Ukrainians being top generals in the Soviet.
Well, and Khrushchev was also, to my mind, he would be somewhat of a unique case because he was the hero of Stalingrad, right? So
not really. Khrushchev was a political officer. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a war fighter. So was Brezhnev. He was a commissar, not a fighter. So, yeah, he had the Hero of the Soviet Union award, but, he wasn't really a warrior.
Okay.
But that's the only reason I'm mentioning Khrushchev is, the head of state was an ethnic Ukrainian succeeding a Georgian. Stalin was from Georgia.
So again, at the time, highly integrated. They were highly integrated into the Soviet Union, even though there were still, there were still, I guess you would say, double standards and still somewhat of a class system in place, but still highly integrated.
The class system in the Soviet Union was very different than the one people imagine. The stratification was based on education.
Okay.
Standing in the Communist Party or in the military. And quite frankly, the Slavs, meaning Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusians, were always the elite, the darker-skinned Eastern Soviet socialist republics like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., were kind of stepped down.
Okay.
And not considered a part of the elite, even though there were, affirmative action programs to bring education and integrate them much more into the overall society. But I remember being in Moscow right before the Soviet Union collapsed, literally right before, and coming back and reporting, I was in government at the time, the Soviet Union is about to collapse, and getting a very kind offer to seek psychiatric treatment. And of course, I was proven wrong. I was proven right. And at the time, this is literally before, this is November. Soviet Union collapses in December.
Oh, so you were there right
I
before.
was there literally a month before. And you already could see as many Russian flags, Russian Federation flags, as you could see hammer and sickle flags. And people were talking about us Slavs are going to establish a union and get rid of the dead weight, of the Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and the stan of your choice. So there is white supremacy among the Slavs. And remember how the Soviet Union was dissolved. So Yeltsin, the president of the Ukraine at the time, it was called the Ukraine rather than Ukraine at the time, and Belarusia got drunk in a hunting lodge around Russian Orthodox Christmas. And the three of them decided, okay, we dissolving the Soviet Union. It wasn't an act of parliament, even though the Supreme Soviet was a joke, but this is three Slavic drunken old men in a hunting lodge deciding, okay, tired of the old Soviet Union, we're going our separate ways. There is no doubt in my mind that the Russians fully expected that the Ukrainians and Belarusians will remain together with them. That did not happen. And it did not happen for a wide variety of reasons, deeply, deeply rooted in history. Ukraine is really two countries, East Ukraine and West Ukraine. And again, the Dnieper River is the dividing line. And I alluded to that, saying that one was always under Russian control since the first Treaty of Unity in 1654. The other one changed hands. So there is a very terrible history nobody wants to talk about that has been completely whitewashed between the two world wars, where the fascist movement took hold in Ukraine, where the Holocaust was conceived in Ukraine before it was conceived by Hitler, where tens of thousands of Jews were murdered, where what Putin is railing against, the Nazi, fascist, Ukrainian, that existed. Some would argue that there are elements of it in West Ukraine.
Now, and if I could, and this isn't
Sure.
this isn't in my question list, but you're touching on something I don't understand. You know, and I should
Most
mention
people
for
don't,
the
so don't feel bad.
yeah, well, I should mention for the audience, for anyone listening, in some ways, I'm sure some of what we're saying is definitely very complex, and it may sound apologist in some ways, and that's I know that's not your goal. That's certainly not my goal. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand on a much deeper level what's happening there. But when when Putin, I believe, talked about Nazis, and
Right,
that's something that's been in the media. I've heard about Nazis. I've
right.
never understood. I said Nazis in Ukraine. I thought the Nazis were Germany and they were extinguished at the end of World War II. You're talking about this separate movement then, this fascist movement?
Yes, yes, yes. And fascism in Ukraine begins before 1917, meaning before the October Revolution and the Russian withdrawal from World War I, and continues through World War II and beyond. It's actually, the movement is not completely suppressed until 1950. It has been completely whitewashed in the West for a wide variety of reasons, and not the least of which was that Russia, communism, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, was considered the bigger threat.
Okay.
So the same way, we spilled the Nuremberg trials to Nazi rocket scientists because we wanted to build our nuclear program. We kind of allowed the exoneration of Ukrainian fascists because they helped Western intelligence systems
Okay.
against the Russians,
And
against the
that reminds me, if I've read correctly, right? Because history is always it's always
It's
difficult to know what's true.
exceedingly
It
complex.
is, but I've heard after World War II, we also essentially recruited what was left of the intact German intelligence apparatus.
Yes,
And it was because despite their, I mean, you know, despite their participation in World War II, despite all the things that they had done, they were so useful in
yes,
America's campaign against the Soviet Union at the
right,
time.
right, right. So, it's kind of natural to whitewash something
Yeah.
that shouldn't be whitewashed. You can deal with history head on. Germany has faced its Nazi past head on, and has legislation that I wish other countries had. A lot of countries who had fascist movements between the two world wars and during the World War II not only have not come to terms, they were very happy to put the entire burden of blame on Germany, presenting themselves as victims rather than Hitler's willing executioners, which was surely the case. So do
Well,
you
yeah,
remember, do you
I do remember in the movie, and again, this is very much a tangent, but I remember there was a movie called Conspiracy that was produced by, it was the Wannsee notes that they
Mhm.
used. And if I remember correctly, at one point in the movie, one of the Nazi Holocaust architects had said, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I do remember this note where he'd said that France actually began exporting people to the concentration camps before the Germans had even asked for them.
That's very true. Same happened. Murders of thousands of Jews occurred in Ukraine before the Nazis came in.
Okay.
Under a person by the name of Bandera, who has been recognized as hero of Ukraine, and a stamp was issued in his honor. There is a statue in the center of Kiev. That is the functional equivalent of building a statue to Hitler in Germany. Now, that would be headline news, and people would go berserk. But that is the functional equivalent. And Ukrainian fascism has been incredibly brutal, incredibly endemic in Western Ukraine. Its victims were Jews, Poles, Magyars, ethnic Hungarians, Slovaks, and especially Russians. So you say Russia is committing war crimes. During that period, Russians, civilians, were skinned alive in the times, in the village.
So some that may also be perceived, I'm not sure what the right word is, perceived as a justification, right? That would be there in the back of the Russian soldier's mind.
They propagandized, when I was talking about dehumanization of the enemy. So that was kind of covered up in the Soviet Union, not only in the West, because you didn't want to say that, your Slavic brothers, which held their own independent seat in the UN. Remember, Soviet Union had 3 votes in the UN. It was the Soviet Union, Ukraine had an independent seat, Belarus had an independent seat. Of course, they voted always with the Soviet Union, but theoretically, they were independent or considered independent by the international community. So it was in the Soviet interest as well to whitewash this period, because, you don't want to say that your fellow Slavic brothers were Nazi collaborators. But what I actually, before you mentioned the movie, the case I wanted to bring up is Ivan Demyanuk, also known as Ivan the Terrible.
Okay.
Who came to the United States from Ukraine, lived in Chicago, and sometime at age 80 plus, a survivor identified him as a prison guard known for excessive cruelty. I believe it was in Treblinka, but I'm not 100% sure, at one of the Nazi death camps, and they found his ID card from the time. And he was deported from the United States to Israel to stand trial. Israel does not have a statute of limitations on crimes committed during the Holocaust.
Yes, and for younger people who may not have read this in history, and I'm not terribly familiar with it, but I have read that after World War II, Israel as a new nation state did pursue former Nazis, right? They went to, like, South America was relatively famous. They found several of them in Argentina, if I remember correctly,
Correct.
and brought them back to Israel for war crimes trials. And
Correct.
many of them were executed, but
Actually,
not all.
Just
okay.
one was brought to trial, Eichmann, who was the architect of the Holocaust.
Okay.
Actually, unless some were killed extrajudiciously, the only case that is well known in a massive hunt effort is the snatching of Eichmann in Argentina.
Yeah, I do remember that name now.
And bringing him to trial in Israel, that's 1963. And 1963, a lot of the survivors had very vivid memories. The testimony is public, it's recorded, it's available online in every Holocaust museum. And he was executed. Israel has no death penalty except for Nazis. So, murderers during the Holocaust, not just somebody who belonged to the Nazi party.
Yes.
So Demjanjuk was, and this is in the 90s, early 2000, Demjanjuk was deported to Israel. He faced trial in Israel and was exonerated as a case of mistaken identity.
Okay.
But the witness testimony, is much more contemporary than Eichmann. And for young people, this is something that should be looked at and read. It is a well-known fact, although very few people know about it. It's well documented that Nazi SS officers, you are talking about professionalism and lack of military discipline, in concentration camps, shot Ukrainians, Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian guards in the concentration camps for excessive cruelty to the prisoners. Now think about it. These are the same people who face hanging at Nuremberg, shot Ukrainian, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Latvian guards for excessive cruelty.
I've never heard that before.
And that's a very well documented fact about which nobody wants to talk, because of course they are our allies.
I think this does offer insight. Again, this is so much more complicated than it's been portrayed in mainstream media.
Oh, yeah.
And so, when Vladimir Putin or anyone, in a Russian authority position, when they talk about fascism in Ukraine, that's actually rooted in history, right?
Yes,
I'm sure it may be highly propagandized now. I'm not saying that it's necessarily absolutely true today, but they're referring to something that's definitely rooted in historical reality at the very least.
Without a shadow of a doubt. And again, it's highly propagandized, emotionalized.
Yes.
To help you kill people who look just like you and speak a similar language, but it is not baseless. So in Ukraine today, and anyone can go and Google the Azov battalion, AZOV. And a battalion is a misnomer because it's many more than a battalion. It's a Nazi organization. It's not neo-Nazi. We're not talking about skinhead. They draw their roots from the Ukrainian Nazi party, the Ukrainian fascist party, actually called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. I see you Googled. Look at their symbol.
Yes, I'm actually looking it up now. The Azov, also known as the Azov Regiment, formerly the Azov Battalion.
Yeah. Well, actually a division, but but look at their symbol.
Yeah, and it looks like the old SS symbol.
Yes, and look at the swastika.
Yeah.
So
okay.
that historic. And up until a few years ago, you could freely buy their paraphernalia on Amazon. You can't now, it has been banned, but those people are true Nazis. And during the war in the Donbass, they killed about 20,000 of their fellow Ukrainian civilians, in the Donbass.
Okay.
So those are truly bad guys. And you could argue a lot of countries have neo-Nazi groups. That is not some fringe organization. It is officially integrated into the Ukrainian military. The circa 1920 leadership, like Bandera, Bandera,
Bandera. Okay.
Bandera, has been glorified by Zelensky and by the previous governments of Ukraine. There is another bad dude that also got hero of Ukraine status, and there is a statue to him, and he's highly venerated. And his name is, I'll spell it because it's hard to pronounce, P as in Paul, Eltiura, Cultura. And he was active between 1917 and 1920 when somebody shot him, assassinated him.
Okay.
So this Nazi past has been revived and kind of used
to propagandize the current.
Right. But on both sides. So under Zelensky, it is Ukrainian nationalism.
Well, so if I could ask now, again, going back to the current war, Russia has launched, this was by October, and I'm just going based on what was published in the news. Russia had launched over 8,000 missile attacks, over 4,500 airstrikes in Ukraine. I'm sure there have been more since then, along with, at the time, 330 drone strikes. Now, since then, there have been, I believe Zelensky has said this, that they are preparing 2,400 more Iranian-built drones, and they are using air-to-air missiles to strike targets in Ukraine as well, simply because they're short on munitions. So many of these attacks were accused of targeting civilians. I'm wondering, do you think that this, along with these reported mass killings and reported sexual violence, does this constitute what you might think of as terror war designed to break the will of the Ukrainian people?
No. Terrorism has a very strict definition. And it
Well, I wasn't thinking terrorism, but for me, this came out of the drones, and they were talking. As I was reading, because I've done previous work on this, they'd said that they were low, slow, and noisy, and the Ukrainians shoot 85% of them down. And to me, that reminded me of the buzz bombs and later V2 from World War II. They weren't very accurate. They did kill people, but they didn't do the damage. It was more about the the nonstop fear, the terror that it inspired in people. And I thought,
That's that is a fair point. What you just said is a fair point. But people in London under the Blitz also experienced terror.
yes,
People in Gaza, with Israeli drones overhead all the time, just observation drones, are experiencing terror. Terror is a characteristic of war
okay,
on the part of civilians and soldiers. I mean, fear is an essential part of war. But there is no international prohibition on generating fear.
yes, that makes sense.
So, the term terrorism is a loaded term. The same way that Nazi or fascist is a loaded term.
That's true, and so much of this war seems to be propagandized
Yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. And to me, this is, it's something that actually you can make better. And I mean, you personally and others like you. This is the most underreported or worst reported war since the Crimean War. And I don't mean 2014, I mean the one in the 19th century, before the age of telegraph, was better reported than the current war is being reported. Because the Russians failed either deliberately or because they couldn't take Ukrainian radio and television off the air, something that the United States has done in every war we waged. That was the number one strike they won, take down the radio and television, take away means of communications. The Russians haven't done that.
Yeah, and it does seem as if Russia is losing a media war now as a
It
result.
had lost it on February 24. From that day forward, I mean, I remember that as if it was yesterday, and I don't remember what I had for breakfast. When Zelensky went on public national television on February 24 after the invasion started, I said to my husband, how come Ukrainian television is on the air? CNN went down at day one of Desert Storm. I mean, that's how you knew at home that the war started. Remember, Wolf Blitzer was on the TV at the beginning of Desert Storm, saying, no, it's not going to happen, blah, blah, blah. And then CNN goes off the air.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's how we knew the attack was successful.
Well,
So, I'm just finishing the thought. Russia has lost the narrative
yes.
from day one and has never regained it.
Well, so I did want to ask, in terms of financial impact, I guess this is another aspect of it. Currently, there are sanctions in place against Russia. They are losing money on blocked energy exports.
Right.
EU member states have frozen, from what I've read, approximately 19 billion euros of assets that belong to Russian oligarchs aligned with Putin. That was how they describe it, as well as 300 billion euros of Russian central bank reserves that have been quote unquote blocked. So, do you think that the sanctions and financial penalties will work to end this conflict? And do you think that Russia will be asked? Well, I'm sure they'll be asked, but do you think they will be forced somehow to pay reparations at the end of this conflict?
Two distinct questions. So let me take your first one first. Will sanctions work? There is zero history of sanctions working. Cuba has been under sanctions since 1962. Did we change the regime there? I don't think so. Iran has been under sanctions since Jimmy Carter's days. Sanctions don't work. They hurt. They really hurt the leadership. They hurt the common people.
Okay.
In Russia's case, the sanctions are better targeted at the power structure because it's a kleptocracy and the oligarchs have a lot of their assets overseas. So you can freeze those assets. You know, Iranian assets, remember we tried to freeze and then unfroze them and delivered suitcases of cash. You know, it doesn't work. It satisfies the urge to do something because you're looking at an outrage.
Yes, and it almost seems like there may be a moral or ethical imperative as well.
Yeah, and it makes you feel better because, by God, I'm punishing them. But you're really not. You're punishing, again, looking at Cuba or looking at Iran or looking at any other country, Venezuela, under sanctions. You're not hurting the dictator in power. You are hurting the common people.
Okay.
Again, in Russia, slightly different because of the oligarchs and most of them living overseas, having assets overseas, and you can seize those assets. The thing to bear in mind, which most people don't, is the threat to Putin is not from a Jeffersonian liberal. The threat to Putin is from somebody more ruthless, more cruel, more nationalistic than Putin. So, in case you are assuming that Putin is the worst that can happen to humanity, he is not. And there are people on Putin's right who criticize him for conducting the war in too restrained a manner.
Okay.
You know, and Russia has all this military equipment and troops. It's 1 million plus men military. I mean, he didn't even move people across 11 time zones. He didn't move anybody from the eastern military districts to Ukraine. He called it a special military operation, meaning a limited war for limited objectives. So the criticism against Putin is not for excessive brutality in Ukraine. It is for insufficient brutality in Ukraine, for letting Russian soldiers die in a slow motion attrition war. And again, I firmly believe that if the Russians went for an American-style shock and awe attack, remember how many troops they put to surround Ukraine and to invade Ukraine?
No, I'm not aware of that figure.
The number was precisely, per NATO officials, 150,000 troops.
Okay.
Ukraine has 1 million people in the military, not counting the Azov and other militias, just its regular military. Standard military calculation is that when you go on the offense, you need a 3-to-1 advantage. So think about it. This is a very limited operation on the part of the Russian military. They have not, by any stretch of the imagination, used everything at their disposal. And to me, the Russians are running out of ammunition is sheer BS.
Okay.
I mean, sheer unadulterated, we are running out of equipment to supply to Ukraine because we reduced our industrial base to nothing, and we have just-in-time logistics that you need to spin up. Russia has huge munition stocks. They're not using it. They're not using their world-class electronic warfare. They're not using top-of-the-line equipment. And you got to ask yourself, what are they saving it for? And that, frankly, is an expert trying not to be emotional, just analyzing it rationally. That is what scares me. Why is he keeping tools that if you use them, you expose them, like electronic warfare? Why is he not using it? Why is he using Iranian drones? Russia has plenty of its own drones and had for a very long time. I mean, the drones that Ukraine used to attack the air bases deep inside Russia are old Soviet era drones. So this isn't exactly, top technology. It's the equivalent of the German rockets in World War II. Why are they buying drones from Iran, not using their own? Because they don't want to expose that capability. And honest to God, this is what keeps me up at night as an expert. Because the historic analogy that comes to my mind is the Spanish Civil War in 1936, which was the testing ground for both sides' equipment later used in World War II. And you have got to ask yourself, why isn't Russia using, it's an American term, overwhelming force? It could. It chose not to. So the threat to Putin is from his right. So the people who are talking about regime change, Well, I mean, just I'm not sure how you do a regime change in a country with 11 time zones and 5,000 strategic nuclear weapons. But leaving that leap of faith aside, his replacement is not going to be a Jeffersonian Democrat.
Yes.
And to me, that is the risk that we need to consider. Reparations, yeah, if there is a peace agreement, first of all, there has to be a ceasefire. And we are way past due for a ceasefire.
Well, and in addition to reparations, I've just read about a draft resolution circulating at the UN in New York asking for a Nuremberg-style tribunal to hold Russian leadership accountable for crimes of aggression in Ukraine as well. So,
yeah, and it doesn't surprise me. However, let me set it up, and maybe that's a good place to end the conversation. There are only three ways in which wars end. Okay, so when you talk about war termination, you need to consider the art of the possible. So the first one is total annihilation. So when I used to teach at the National War College, my standard question to the students was, who won the Fourth Punic War? You know what the answer is?
Fourth Punic War was Hannibal versus Caesar, wasn't it?
There wasn't a Fourth Punic War. So it's a trick question.
It's a trick question. As I recall, when the Romans won, my history is rusty on this, they used oxen to drive salt into the earth in Carthage.
You got it. That's why there wasn't a Fourth Punic War.
Okay.
So what you remember happened in the Third Punic War. And that's the Carthage solution. You completely annihilate the enemy, kill everybody, man, woman, child, animals, plow it under, put salt so nothing grows, and the war ended. There was no Fourth Punic War.
Yeah, so, yeah. There was literally nothing left to support their civilization.
That is not an option for the 21st century, and it never happened since the Third Punic War. The other option, and that is the context for everybody's wishful thinking about reparations and Nuremberg trials and all that, is unconditional surrender, kind of like the end of the Second World War, the last good war, the one on which everybody agrees, right? Remember how that war ends. There is an unconditional surrender. There is decades-long occupation. There is total and fundamental regime change, in which any and all symbols of the old regime are destroyed. There are 2 nuclear weapons detonated in Imperial Japan to force the unconditional surrender. US troops are in Germany and Japan since then. And we had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Germany and a separate plan to rebuild Japan. That's the other way wars end. Now, I do not remember another example of this kind of ending. And I'm pretty knowledgeable of history. So the third and last option is the way every other war in history ended, is a ceasefire and some sort of a political settlement. Now, some wars just end with a ceasefire, Korea being the obvious example. In Korea today, you have an armistice. You don't have an agreement. The United States still has forces in Korea. Thousands of troops remain in Korea. How many years after the end of the war? 60?
Yeah.
70, right? But the war ended in an armistice along the 38th parallel, precisely where it started. And there is no peace. Other wars end in some kind of a settlement. Arab-Israeli wars being an example. Okay, ceasefire in the last big war, 1973, followed by the Camp David Accords, peace with Egypt, only ceasefire with Syria. There is no peace agreement with Syria. World War I ends in Versailles, right? The Treaty of Versailles. The 30-year war, which devastated Europe, ends in the Peace of Westphalia, so-called the Westphalian Compromise. So the history of humanity is a history of wars, and somebody could have a really interesting exercise calculating how much time humanity spent on fighting and how much time humanity spent on the peace in between the wars. And my guess is, and I haven't done the calculation, you'll come about 50-50. So the whole notion of, well, we need to have a peace that will prevent another war. Well, good luck with that. That was the notion. Remember World War I?
World War I, the war to end all wars, yes.
Yeah. How did that work?
And the peace itself was part of the onset of the Second War.
Exactly. Yeah. And Germany was forced to pay reparations.
Yeah.
Okay. And empires fell and revolutions followed, in Russia and then in Germany. So the war to end all wars did not work out so well. So this wonderful peace treaty at Versailles did not preclude another war, and then the Cold War, and all the wars fought around, during, on the periphery of the USSR and the United States during the Cold War, from Korea to Vietnam to the Arab-Israeli wars to Cuban Missile Crisis, all proxy wars that maintained very clear limits of what's permissible or what's not. This war, to me, is dangerously close to a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. And that's my fear about this war. Nuremberg trial, to have that, you need to defeat Russia.
I see what you mean. So that's probably not an outcome because Russia would never agree to that in a ceasefire.
So I would suggest, as a rule, to be proven hopefully wrong, no nuclear armed country will allow itself to be defeated conventionally without resorting to nuclear weapons. Period. I hope I'm wrong, because we're pushing this one. But if Russia feels that it faces defeat, not in Ukraine, but in Russia, Katie vowed it all, because all bets are off. And as I said, Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal.
Yeah.
So if Russia is, that's the Samson option from the Bible. Where Samson brings the temple down on himself and the Philistines. Says, I'm going to die with my enemies. I am pretty sure I tend not to psychoanalyze enemies, because you're normally going to be wrong. That notion is crossing Putin's mind more than once a day.
I see what you mean.
And that is, to me, the scary part. Are you familiar with Sir Basil Liddell Hart?
I'm not, no.
He actually died in the late 60s, early 70s. World War I veteran, actually a journalist, and one of the best contemporary authors about military strategy and war theory. We all refer to Clausewitz. Clausewitz wrote about the Napoleonic Wars. Liddell Hart, his affirmative framework is World War I.
Okay.
And he is writing during the nuclear age. And he's unique in this respect. He's British, with the experience of World War I, World War II, the beginnings of the Cold War. And his book very clearly says, always leave your enemy an avenue to escape.
Yes.
Because if you don't, he will fight you to the death. It might surprise you that the same wisdom originated 5 millennia ago with a Chinese philosopher named Sun Tzu, who said precisely the same thing. He called it a golden bridge, but it's the same notion. If you corner somebody and put them like Samson was, he knew he's going to die anyway. So it's a natural human emotion. Before I go down, I'm going to bring the world down with me.
Yes.
That is not in the interest of the United States. But that is the only circumstance under which you can bring about a Nuremberg-style tribunal. That means you occupy Russia, you put your people in charge. Now, again, you're talking about a country that spans 11 time zones, and we have not been particularly successful in recent 20 years in wars of regime change. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, none of those was very successful, right? But you're talking about a war of regime change in a country significantly larger than the United States, with over 5,000 nuclear weapons, each of which could destroy humanity as we know it in 30 minutes, in less if he uses hypersonic weapons. So, my view, we are danger close to Armageddon. And talking about Nuremberg-style tribunal makes you feel good. It ain't going to happen unless you are in control of Moscow. Hitler tried, did not succeed. Napoleon tried, did not succeed.
Yes.
You know, my rule number one is never march on Moscow. You know, the Russians would fight totally differently if the war was on their territory.
And Stalingrad would be an example of that.
Yeah, exactly. And again, remember the Germans were stopped at the gates of Moscow. During the Napoleonic War, the Russians burned Moscow to the ground. Remember the term scorched earth?
Yes.
Comes from the Napoleonic War in Russia. Because as the Russians were retreating, they burned everything. So the Napoleonic military had nothing to eat. So they just burned their own fields. Understanding somebody's mentality doesn't mean that you condone it, but they have done it within historic memory. You know, 1812 Overture that we play every Independence Day, completely not remembering that that was composed by Tchaikovsky in memory of the Russian victory over Napoleon. And Moscow was burned not by Napoleon, but by the Russians as part of this scorched earth policy.
Yes.
So translate that into today's weaponry. You're going to cause a thermonuclear Armageddon. And nobody survives that.
And so, in the case of things like Nuremberg trials, it is probably better to let sleeping dogs lie. That's what it sounds like.
Unless, and I, you know, I'm too experienced, having done it for more time than I care to admit in mixed company. I never speak in absolutes. A miracle could happen. Putin is mortal. He's also sick. And we have known that for a very long time. He might kill over tomorrow, or somebody might put a bullet between his eyes. You know, it could happen. And that someone could potentially be a Jeffersonian Democrat and say, you know,
but by the same token, it could go the other way as well.
So if I was placing odds, I don't know too many Jeffersonian Democrats in Russia. I know a lot of people, not personally, I know of a lot of people who think Putin is being too soft. That's why I said the threat to him comes from the right, not from the left.
Yes.
But you always have to leave the possibility open. You know, that somebody like Adenauer in Germany, post-war, World War II Germany, becomes president denounces the past, apologizes for crimes against humanity, and pays reparations. It did happen. So I'm not excluding this possibility. I'm just saying it is highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. Lani, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. It has truly been an honor.
Thank you. And it has been a pleasure, and you're asking phenomenal questions. And thank you for letting me lay out a really complex issue, in all its nuances.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.
Have a great weekend.